They said the air at Moss Creek turned heavier after midnight, the kind of silence that made even the crickets stop. Somewhere between the sound of the river and the low creak of the pines, you could almost hear the echo of boots on dirt, slow, deliberate, measured, the way she used to walk when choosing who would live and who would be called to her room. Her name was Eleanor Cresswell, and in the spring of 1841, she did something no Southern man could forgive and no historian would dare preserve. When her husband Thomas died suddenly, his death labeled apoplexy by a doctor who couldn't meet her eyes, Eleanor inherited Moss Creek Plantation, 370 acres of Georgia soil, and nearly 24 slaves. Most widows of her class sold everything and remarried. She did not. Within months, she dismissed her overseer, took command of the fields, and began making decisions that unnerved her neighbors. She ordered new locks on every cabin. She kept a detailed ledger that no one was permitted to see, and she began purchasing only young, strong male slaves, men between 18 and 25, at prices that made other planters whisper. By 1843, her plantation ledger showed extraordinary profits, but those who worked her land knew something was wrong. They noticed her nightly rituals. Every Saturday she would light the lamps in her upstairs chamber, bathe alone in rose water, and summon 2 men from the quarters. One would leave at dawn, the other never returned. Years later, when a Charleston broker reviewing Moss Creek's financial books noticed a strange pattern, 23 men sold over 15 years, all listed in prime condition certified, he uncovered the surface of a secret buried deeper than any grave. Because at Moss Creek, prime condition didn't mean strength or obedience, it meant chosen. Every man Eleanor bought was forced to compete for her bed. A ritual she claimed tested their loyalty, strength, and purity of blood. The one who pleased her would be sold for profit. The one who failed vanished. What Eleanor Cresswell created at Moss Creek wasn't a plantation, it was a laboratory of power, and what began as lust became something much darker, a controlled experiment in domination, corruption, and revenge written in human flesh. The first time anyone mentioned the locked box beneath her floorboards was in 1857, 16 years after Eleanor Cresswell took full control of Moss Creek. A traveling broker, curious about her immaculate bookkeeping, noticed something impossible. Her official plantation ledgers were perfect, too perfect. Every expenditure balanced, every sale logged, every figure rounded to the cent. But the handwriting changed. Sometimes delicate, almost tender. Other times sharp and manic, as if 2 minds shared the same quill. What no one outside Moss Creek knew was that Eleanor kept 3 sets of records, one for the county, one for herself, and one written in cipher, a code based on old shipping manifests she had learned from her father's business in Savannah. That secret ledger was hidden in an iron box under the floor of her bedroom, right below the foot of her bed. Inside it, each name she bought was listed with disturbing precision: eye color, height, scars, body odor, voice tone, bone width, thigh circumference. But beside these measurements were notations no broker would understand, words like yield, reaction, obedience during selection. Some entries had small crosses drawn beside them. Others had full paragraphs written in trembling script, describing events that were not agricultural at all. The slaves on Moss Creek whispered of the 7th night. That was when Eleanor would call the chosen men to the main house. The others knew the pattern: the week of silence, the white dress, the lamp burning in her window until morning. The ones who returned from her room spoke little, eyes hollow, movements slower. They had competed for something they didn't comprehend, and won a kind of survival that felt worse than death. Those who failed never returned to the quarters. Eleanor said they had been transferred west, sold to planters in Alabama or Mississippi. The paperwork always matched her claim. Bills of sale, receipts, signatures, all perfect. But wagons were seen leaving Moss Creek at midnight with no driver, no lanterns, moving silently toward the far edge of her property where the soil was too rocky for cotton. She told her field hands not to till that land. She said she would plant an orchard there one day. But no orchard ever came. Only a patch of ground that the slaves refused to walk across, because sometimes, late at night, the earth seemed to breathe. The Charleston broker's name was Edwin Barrow, a man known for his obsession with precision, not morality. He had no interest in the suffering that built the South's wealth. But in April of 1857, while auditing Moss Creek's ledgers for a private buyer, he stumbled across something that unsettled even him. In her official accounts, Eleanor Cresswell recorded the sale of a man named Samuel, prime condition certified. The bill of sale was dated March 1843, the signature of the transporter, the receipt from the buyer in Alabama, all perfect. But Barrow noticed something else. The shipment records from that same week showed no transport leaving Moss Creek. No wagon ordered, no ferryman hired, no notation of delivery. And yet the payment had been received. It was a small inconsistency, but Edwin Barrow was not a man who ignored details. He checked again. The same anomaly appeared 5 more times. Different names, different buyers, all between 1843 and 1847. Each one prime condition certified. Each one vanishing from all trace. He sent a letter to Eleanor requesting clarification. Her reply was polite, efficient, even charming. She suggested that perhaps his records were incomplete. She attached copies of every document he requested, each stamped, sealed, signed. It should have silenced his doubts, but it didn't, because one signature, the transporter's, was identical across multiple years. Not similar, identical, every curve of ink, every flourish, as if it had been copied by the same trembling hand. So he traveled to Georgia. He expected an aging widow desperate to protect her reputation. What he found was something else entirely. Eleanor met him on the porch in a plain gray dress, her hair pinned tight, her eyes steady and cold. She invited him in for tea. Her voice was calm, almost kind, but her questions were surgical. "You've been studying my accounts, Mr. B. Arrow?" she asked. "Tell me, do numbers ever frighten you?" That night, while staying in the guest quarters, Barrow heard something, faint, rhythmic, metallic, echoing from beneath the barn. It wasn't a forge, and it wasn't tools. It was too deliberate, too slow. A single metallic strike, followed by silence. Then again. Then again. He later wrote in his private notes, "There is a sound beneath Moss Creek that is not made by machines. I believe she is recording something, not in ink, but in flesh." Edwin Barrow waited until the plantation slept. The cicadas screamed across the humid dark, and the scent of magnolia mingled with something far heavier, iron, salt, and rot. He followed the faint metallic rhythm he'd heard before, barefoot, down the slope past the smokehouse, past the animal pens that had gone eerily still. The barn loomed before him, its doors chained but slightly ajar, the sliver of a lantern flickering inside. He pressed one eye to the gap and froze. There was a table, not for crops or tools, but for something surgical. Polished wood darkened by stains that didn't come from animals. A pulley hung from the rafters, rope fibers black with age. And in the corner, covered by a tattered sheet, were 6 standing frames, each roughly the height of a man. Eleanor stood in the center of it all, calm, deliberate, wearing a white dressing gown that made her look almost spectral. Her back was to him. She was humming softly, a tune Edwin didn't recognize, not him, not folk song, something older, She reached for one of the sheets and pulled it away. The light fell on a shape that made Barrow's mind collapse into denial. It was not a sculpture, and it was not alive. It was something between both. A man's body skinned and preserved, the muscles varnished, the mouth sealed by black thread. Its hands were locked around a silver tag that read, in neat engraving, Samuel, certified 1843. There were 5 more behind it, each labeled with a name from her ledger, each perfectly preserved, each prime condition. Eleanor stepped closer to one of them, running her hand over the chest, her voice steady. "Numbers never frighten me," she whispered, "but silence does. So I keep what I've sold." Barrow's hand slipped against the wood of the door and the sound echoed. She stopped, turned. Her eyes found him instantly through the slit in the door, and she smiled. "Mr. Barrow," she said softly, "I didn't hear you knock." He stumbled backward, his rational mind already unraveling, but before he could flee, 2 of her overseers appeared behind him, silent, lanterns in hand. Eleanor walked slowly toward him through the doorway. "Now you'll see," she said, "why I never lose track of a transaction." They dragged Edwin Barrow down the narrow steps beneath the barn, through air so heavy it felt alive. The lanterns flickered against brick walls blackened with soot, revealing what at first looked like root cellars. But as they descended, the corridors opened into chambers, each one lined with wooden frames, each one occupied. The smell hit first. Not death exactly, but preservation. The sickly mix of brine, smoke, and human decay. The flickering light revealed a series of figures, upright, silent, glistening faintly in the dimness. Barrow realized with horror that these were men, enslaved men, posed in lifelike stances, their bodies perfectly cured, their eyes sealed beneath wax. Each had a tag. Each tag bore a name and a number. Eleanor followed behind him, her bare feet making no sound on the stone. "The flesh remembers," she said calmly, as if reciting scripture. "Paper fades, ink lies, but the body, oh, the body tells the truth." She gestured toward one figure, whose arms were lifted as if in plea. This one tried to run. Sold twice before, yet no record of his punishment. I corrected that omission. Barrow's voice trembled. "You preserved them?" She tilted her head, amused. "Preserved? No, Mr. Barrow. I documented them. Every ledger deserves a witness." He could barely stand. The walls seemed to pulse with the echoes of slow dripping. He saw jars, rows of them, filled with eyes, with teeth, with fragments labeled and arranged like currency. On a desk at the far end of the chamber sat her book, The Ledger of Moss Creek. Its pages were soaked through with stains the color of rust, and in the margins, faint impressions of fingerprints. Eleanor opened it tenderly, turning a page. "You'll find your name here soon enough. Every man who questions Moss Creek becomes part of its account." She looked at him then, almost lovingly. "You're fortunate. Few are remembered so thoroughly." Barrow stumbled backward, shouting for help. His voice echoed, then was swallowed whole by the stone. The overseers seized him again. Eleanor closed the book. "Put him in chamber 6, she said. "He's already been accounted for." As they dragged him toward the dark, he caught one last sight, a half-finished figure strung to the wall. Its eyes were still open, its lips faintly moving. And when the lantern light passed, Barrow swore he saw it mouth the words, "Certified." 3 months later, Edwin Barrow's horse was found wandering near the Savannah River, saddle intact, riderless. No one looked long. The official word, whispered through Charleston's counting houses, was that he'd drowned. His files were quietly reassigned. His name was struck from the Bureau's roster by autumn, but one man noticed. Thomas Wren, Barrow's junior clerk, discovered a bundle of correspondence hidden in the lining of his mentor's desk drawer, a series of half-burned letters marked Private, Moss Creek Plantation. The letters contained nothing overtly criminal, only fragments of Barrow's shorthand, but one line appeared over and over again. Recording in flesh, the living ledger. Wren, cautious and half-terrified, took the packet to the state records office. The clerk on duty refused to accept it. The next day, when he returned, the office had been mysteriously reorganized. All mention of Barrow's audit, his name, his ledgers, even his payment stubs, had been erased. But Wren was young, idealistic. He traveled to Georgia himself. When he arrived at Moss Creek, he found the property quiet, the fields overgrown, the house shuttered. The overseers were gone. The locals avoided the road entirely, muttering about voices in the cellar. He finally met Eleanor at dusk. Standing on her porch, dressed in mourning black, though no husband had died, she greeted him warmly, as if expecting him. "You must be Mr. Wren," she said. "Come inside. I was wondering when they'd send another man of ink." Inside, the house felt unnaturally clean, too empty. The air carried the faint scent of chemicals, turpentine and something metallic. She offered him tea. He declined. Her smile widened. "You think I frighten poor Mr. Barrow, don't you?" she asked softly. He was always too clever for his own good. Wren told her he was there only to recover Barrow's audit records. She led him to a cabinet, opened a drawer, and withdrew a single sheet. It was Barrow's handwriting, but the words had been rearranged, inverted, distorted. In the margins he saw notes that weren't his. Verified, preserved, transcribed. "Do you understand now?" she asked. "You accountants call it balance. I call it remembrance." Wren's hand trembled as he looked closer. The paper wasn't parchment. It was tanned hide, smooth, slightly translucent, human. He dropped it, stumbled back, but Eleanor caught his wrist gently. "You came to collect the records," she whispered. "Now you'll be one." By the summer of 1858, Moss Creek had gone quiet, too quiet for a plantation that once pulsed with commerce. Travelers passing through spoke of the fields lying fallow, the air thick with a strange metallic scent that clung even after rain. But the locals knew better. They said the soil was rejecting something. The first to notice were the field hands on neighboring properties. After heavy storms, they found the creek water turning red, not muddy, but crimson, like it carried blood. The livestock refused to drink. At night, the frogs stopped singing, and when the wind shifted from the south, a low moaning could be heard drifting across the swamp. They said it wasn't the wind. Rumors spread fast in small counties, faster still when no one dared confirm them. The postmaster of Jackson County claimed he saw Eleanor Cresswell walking the grounds at midnight, barefoot, her dress soaked through, whispering into the earth as if speaking to someone buried beneath it. Others swore she hadn't aged a day since her husband's death 2 decades prior. Then came the rain of September 1858. It lasted 3 days straight. When the skies finally cleared, parts of Moss Creek had collapsed into itself, the barns, the cellar, even the main house porch. Neighbors who came to help found the soil slick with something viscous, not mud, but oil dark and foul. And beneath it, they said, the outlines of human forms pressed upward as though reaching from below. Sheriff Harlan Greaves rode out 2 days later. His report, though brief, survived. Upon examination of the Cresswell grounds, found evidence of severe flooding and submersion of outbuildings. Discovered exposed remains in advanced preservation state, not fresh. Condition unnatural. Mrs. Cresswell calm, uninjured, and uncooperative. When Greaves asked to search beneath the barn, Eleanor simply said, "You'll find them all accounted for, Sheriff. Every man, woman, and child who ever left this place, they're still here." That night, Greaves's deputy resigned. The sheriff never filed the remainder of his notes. By winter, the county maps marked Moss Creek as unfit for habitation. Eleanor remained living alone among the ruins, still tending to her records. And when the rains returned the next spring, the soil bled again. Neighbors stopped calling it Moss Creek. They began to call it Ledger Ground, where debts were never forgiven and every secret was kept in flesh. In 1863, when Union troops marched through Georgia under Sherman's campaign, Moss Creek was already a ghost of itself, half swallowed by vines, half sunk into its own rot. But what drew them there wasn't strategy. It was the smoke, a thin black column rising from land that should have been abandoned. Captain Silas Moore led a company of 20 men through the cypress marshes. They found the main house untouched by fire, its shutters closed, its porch lantern still burning, as if someone had lit it that very morning. No slaves, no overseers, just silence. When they entered, the soldiers expected traps, maybe a sniper. Instead, they found rows of ledgers stacked neatly on the dining table. Dozens of them, each labeled with a year, each filled to the brim with names. And next to them, a small open journal written in a fine, looping hand. Inventory preserved, ledgers balanced, the flesh will not forget. Eleanor Cresswell appeared at the top of the staircase, calm, barefoot, wearing a dress so pale it seemed to absorb the light. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "I was wondering when the North would come to audit my work." Captain Moore ordered her detained. She didn't resist. "You'll want to burn the barn," she advised. "That's where the heat is coming from." The men forced the doors open. What met them inside stopped even the most hardened soldier in his tracks. Beneath the warped floorboards, faint smoke rose, not from fire but from a deep, slow chemical reaction, like flesh trying to breathe. The air shimmered. A soldier pried up a board and dropped his torch in. What they saw would never make the official report. Beneath the barn was a pit, circular, stone-lined, filled with perfectly preserved bodies arranged like a clock. 12 of them, each upright, facing inward, each tagged, polished, and sealed. But the strangest part was the warmth. The flesh was warm to the touch, not decaying, not dead. Warm. Moore demanded an explanation. Eleanor only smiled. "It's simple arithmetic," she said. "When you sell a man's body, you divide his worth. I only gathered the remainders." One soldier vomited, another began to pray. Moore ordered the place torched immediately, but when they returned to the house to seize Eleanor, she was gone, vanished. Her footprints led to the field and stopped, as if she'd stepped down into the earth itself. They burned Moss Creek that night. The barn collapsed first. The pit screamed. By dawn, the land was ash, but beneath it the soil still steamed. After the war, most men who'd survived Sherman's march wanted nothing more than to forget it, but some couldn't, and among them were the 20 who'd burned Moss Creek. It began quietly. A farmer's wife in Ohio reported her husband waking each night at exactly 3:17, drenched in sweat, muttering that the soil was breathing again. Another, a blacksmith in Indiana, complained of a smell that followed him everywhere, a faint, metallic sweetness, like blood left too long in heat. He'd scrub his hands raw, but it lingered. By 1868, 5 of the men were dead. One slit his throat in a church vestibule. Another drowned himself in a trough, though his farm lay miles from any river. Each death came with the same detail noted in local reports. Their mouths were sewn shut, coarse black thread. Captain Silas Moore, the man who gave the order to burn the barn, lived the longest. But even he wasn't untouched. In letters to his sister, now archived in the Library of Congress, he described recurring dreams of Eleanor Cresswell standing at the edge of his field, barefoot in the frost, holding a ledger to her chest. "She whispers it to me every night," Moore wrote. "Certified, certified, as if I've been sold." He grew paranoid, convinced something of Moss Creek had survived the fire. In 1872, he returned to Georgia to see for himself. He found the land untouched, the barn rebuilt by new owners who knew nothing of its past. But the soil was wrong, still dark, still faintly warm. Moore dug where the pit had been. 3 feet down, he struck something solid, not wood, not stone, flesh. He ran, never spoke of it again. But his final letter, found after his death in 1875, contained a single page torn from a ledger. The handwriting wasn't his. Across it, in elegant script, Captain Silas Moore, verified, account settled, Moss Creek, 1863. The ink wasn't ink. Laboratory tests, a century later, revealed traces of hemoglobin. By then, the legend of the bleeding plantation had taken root in Southern folklore, a cursed place where the ground remembers names and where ledgers are written not in books, but in blood. And somewhere, deep beneath that soil, something was still balancing its accounts. In 1934, nearly 70 years after Moss Creek burned, the Tennessee Valley Authority commissioned a land survey for a proposed hydroelectric project. 2 surveyors, Frank Callahan and Lewis Trent, were assigned to chart the ruins of Middle Georgia plantations, including the land where Moss Creek had stood. They arrived in autumn. The air smelled of decay and rain, the ground damp with an unseasonable chill. Locals avoided the site, whispering warnings, "Don't stir that earth. The ledger ground doesn't forgive." But curiosity outweighed caution. Callahan and Trent found little at first: broken bricks, twisted iron, and a foundation sunk into moss. Yet beneath the main barn site, their auger struck something dense. Not stone, not clay, flesh. By noon, they'd uncovered a mass of preserved material, rows of what appeared to be human remains, calcified yet supple, each wrapped in a thin membrane. A faint shimmer clung to them, like wet glass under moonlight. Trent recoiled. Callahan, his hands trembling, pulled one free. It was a hand, perfectly intact, bearing faint writing under the skin. They documented everything, but before they could report, strange things began. Their instruments malfunctioned, compass needles spun. Nights brought dreams both vivid and horrific. A pale woman in gray, barefoot, whispering numbers and names. Over and over she said one word: certified. On the 4th day, Callahan vanished. Trent claimed he heard him calling from beneath the soil, screaming something that sounded like the rustle of paper. Alone, Trent dug deeper. He uncovered a stone slab etched with symbols, a ledger carved into flesh and bone. The marks were unmistakable: names, dates, physical descriptions. Some matched records of slaves sold by Eleanor Cresswell. Others were unknown, as if they were still being added. At the center, one phrase burned into the stone in a scrya, IPT so fine it seemed impossibly deliberate. The account remains unsettled. Trent fled Moss Creek that night. He left behind his tools, his notebook, and Callahan's boots. In his final letter, found pinned to a tree near the excavation site, he wrote, "If you dig there, know this: it will answer you. It will call your name, and you will pay what is owed." Decades later, the TVA recorded that the site had collapsed into itself, the pit sealed beneath earth and roots. But locals still swear that after storms, the air near Moss Creek carries a faint rustle, like the turning of pages, and the whisper of one word: certified. Today, Moss Creek exists only in whispers and old maps. The land was sold decades ago, subdivided, built over. Roads carve through it now, homes stand where the barn once rotted, and children play unaware above something older, something patient. But Moss Creek's ledger did not die with the plantation. It persists, in rumor, in dreams, in certain men who swear they can still hear Eleanor Cresswell's voice. Some are descendants of the plantation's victims, others are scholars, historians, or grave diggers who have come too close to her secret. Dr. Marianne Colson, a historian specializing in antebellum plantations, uncovered her first clue in 1998 while researching slave sale records. She found an unmarked ledger in a forgotten archive, bound in human skin, its pages written in a cipher no modern linguist could fully decode. She brought it to the attention of several universities. None published it. Some destroyed their copies. Those who kept it reported strange effects: insomnia, paranoia, a compulsion to return to Moss Creek. Colson herself began receiving letters, unsigned, written on faded parchment, with the single word certified repeated over and over. They arrived with no return address, always in sets of 3, always postmarked from different towns in Georgia. She traveled there in 2002, driven by a mixture of academic curiosity and something darker. Locals warned her, "Don't look under the ground." But she went anyway. She found that the house had vanished entirely. The road was different. The trees seemed older, thicker, as though time itself resisted her presence. That night, Colson recorded in her journal, "I dreamt of her. A pale woman, barefoot, standing in a darkened room, writing in a ledger no one could read. She looked up at me and whispered, 'You cannot leave until the account is balanced.'" Colson never returned to her academic work. In 2005, she vanished without trace. Her journal was recovered years later in a library archive, pages stained and brittle, the last entry simply, "I am part of the ledger now." And now, the men who come to Moss Creek speak of the same thing. A pull beneath the earth, a whisper in the wind, a ledger written not in ink, but in flesh, demanding to be read. Because Moss Creek was never just a plantation. It was an account, a debt recorded in human lives, and debts, once written, are never forgotten. What no archive had revealed until recently was that Eleanor Cresswell kept her own personal journal, hidden for decades in the hollow of a cypress tree near Moss Creek. When found in 2009 by a descendant of a local historian, the journal was bound in oil-dark leather, brittle with age, its pages soaked with something that no laboratory could identify. The entries were not simple records. They were confessions, invitations, warnings. Eleanor wrote not to justify herself, but to explain the ledger's purpose in the coldest terms she could summon. "They call me monster. They will call me witch, but they do not understand. This is not about vengeance. This is about balance. Slavery is built on debts, not debts of coin, but debts of flesh and blood. I have catalogued them. I have named them. And I will collect them." She described the selection process in chilling detail, referring to it as the ceremony of certification. Each chosen man, she explained, was part of a ledger no court would hold. A ledger written in bone and muscle, a ledger that could not be silenced. They will say the dead cannot speak, but they can. They speak in bodies, in bones. I listen, I write, and I will see to it that every name is known before the ledger closes. The later entries grew darker. Eleanor described speaking to someone she called the custodian, an entity she claimed dwelled beneath Moss Creek, guarding the ledger and binding its accounts. She wrote that he required something in return for keeping her work safe. Blood, sacrifice, obedience. "I have given him what he demands, and he has given me what I need. A ledger that outlives me. A ledger that speaks beyond time." The last entry was not signed. Instead, it bore a single word carved into the page in sharp, deliberate strokes. Certified. No historian has yet confirmed the existence of this custodian, but those who have handled the journal speak of an unease that persists, a creeping certainty that Eleanor Cresswell did not simply die, that her ledger was not destroyed, that it still waits deep in the earth with her name written somewhere at the top. And somewhere, Beneath the land of Moss Creek, something waits with it. By the turn of the 21st century, Moss Creek had transformed from an abandoned plot of land into something far darker, a nexus of obsession. The story of Eleanor Cresswell and her ledger became a ghost myth, whispered in academic circles, occult forums, and hidden corners of the deep web. A strange network began to form. It was not an organized group in the usual sense, but a scattered brotherhood of scholars, grave diggers, and what they called ledger seekers. They were drawn to Moss Creek like moths to a flame, driven by fragments of Eleanor's code that had surfaced in unexpected places, in slave sale records, in 19th century newspapers, even in the margins of unrelated plantation ledgers kept in forgotten libraries. These fragments, once studied, revealed a disturbing pattern. The cipher Eleanor used was not random. It was a language of debts, a ledger language that recorded not only names, but debts of flesh, debts of blood, debts of soul. And those who deciphered even a piece of it spoke of hearing her voice, not in sound, but in something deeper, an awareness, a pull, a compulsion to return. One such man was Marcus Kane, a former cryptographer turned rogue historian. Kane dedicated his life to Eleanor's ledger. In his apartment, he covered walls with transcriptions, photographs, and strange diagrams, maps of Moss Creek layered with symbols no one alive could read. Kane claimed that the ledger was not finished, that Cresswell had left it open, and that it still hung in balance. "It's why she did it," Kane told a small audience at a private meeting of occult scholars in Savannah. "She knew the ledger was eternal, that her work would outlive her body. Moss Creek is not a place, it's a ledger, and it's still open." Kane's followers began leaving markings near the Moss Creek site, chalk symbols, rings of salt, ledger-like scratches on tree trunks. They swore they could hear her in the wind, whispering that single word, certified. Then Kane disappeared. His last public note was found pinned to the door of his study. "The debt is due. The ledger will call you." Since then, Moss Creek has become a pilgrimage site for those who believe Eleanor's ledger holds forbidden knowledge, not just about the past, but about the debts every living man carries. Some call it madness, others call it truth, but all agree on one thing: Moss Creek is alive, and it will not be silent. There are men today who claim they have answered Moss Creek's call. They speak quietly, in hushed tones, because the story they carry is dangerous, not dangerous in the sense of law, but dangerous in the sense of truth, the kind that changes a man forever. They call themselves the Certified, not a society, not a brotherhood, but a scattered group bound by the same claim, that somewhere beneath the soil of Moss Creek lies Eleanor Cresswell's ledger, and that it calls to certain men, calls them by name, offers them entry, but only at a cost. One man, who gave his name only as James T., says he first heard it in a dream, a voice, soft but absolute, whispering, "Certified." He awoke certain of two things: that the word was a summons, and that he could not resist it. Within weeks, he was in Georgia, standing at the moss-choked edge of what had once been the Cresswell Plantation. He says the earth there is different, denser, warmer, breathing. At night, he swears, the soil hums beneath his feet. The first time he descended into the ground, he described something impossible: a room beneath the barn, larger than the barn itself, lit by a pale, unnatural light. And there, in the center, lay the ledger, bound in flesh, etched in bone, its pages alive with a language older than slavery itself. He claims Eleanor Cresswell's voice spoke again, telling him exactly what the ledger required. He would have to write his own debt, his own name, his own truth. Another man, calling himself Elias, insists he survived the descent only because he obeyed her terms. He refused to open the ledger fully, but he still carries the price. Sleep evades him. Shadows move in his periphery. He hears the whisper of certified in every quiet room. They warn of what comes next, that Moss Creek does not forget, that debts, once written in that ledger, demand payment sooner or later. And they say, Elu, Eleanor Creswell still stands there somewhere, barefoot in the dark, writing, watching, waiting. This is not folklore. This is not legend. This is testimony. Men who claim to have looked at the ledger say, there is no turning back. The ledger marks you, changes you, claims you, and Moss Creek waits for its next name. The final entry in Eleanor Creswell's hidden journal was not meant for the public. It was a warning, a command sealed in ink and flesh, addressed to anyone who might one day stand where she once stood. It read, "The ledger is not mine. It is not the soil's. It belongs to something older, something patient. It keeps account. It marks the debt of every man who has walked Moss Creek. You will not stumble here by chance. The ledger calls the men it requires. And if it calls you, know this. It is because you owe, not in coin, not in word, but in blood. Your name is already written." She described her final act with a chilling clarity. Eleanor wrote that she had deliberately built Moss Creek as a ledger in itself, a living archive of debts. Every choice, every purchase, every death was part of her calculation. "I have given them proof in bone, proof in records, proof in silence. This ledger will outlive me, and it will call forth those who must answer. The cost is your life. But it is not my price to set. It is yours." The entry ended with a single symbol drawn in the margins, a circle intersected by a line, overlaid with the word certified, a symbol that no scholar has conclusively decoded. Some say it is a signature. Others insist it is a seal. What is certain is that Moss Creek continues to call. The ledger is said to have never been complete. That entry was Eleanor's final note to herself and to those who might follow, a summons written across time. Historians have debated whether Creswell's work was justice or madness. Was she a woman exacting vengeance upon a corrupt system, or had she become the very darkness she sought to destroy? Perhaps both. But the deeper truth is far more dangerous. The ledger does not belong to Eleanor Creswell anymore. If it still exists, it belongs to Moss Creek, and Moss Creek answers to no one. The question now is not whether the ledger waits, but whether it has already chosen its next name. And that name could be yours. What most dismiss as legend, the ledger of Moss Creek, may be far more than a story of the past. There are men today who believe it is not buried, that it has never been buried, that it has simply shifted, evolved, becoming part of something larger, something that still moves in the shadows of modern life. These men speak of the ledger not as paper bound in bone, but as a system, a hidden architecture of control. They say Eleanor Creswell's work was the blueprint for it. Her certification was not merely a mark in a book. It was a protocol, a way to assign debt, to track it, to call men to account long after her body was gone. They call it the system of the certified. It is not written openly. It exists in the patterns of law, in financial ledgers, in genealogy records, in the unseen contracts of human life. Those who have studied it say the ledger of Moss Creek became a seed that grew into hidden networks, a silent code that governs everything from bloodlines to power. A former operative in such a network, speaking under oath and only under condition of anonymity, said this: "They don't tell you about the ledger. They just make sure you live under its terms. You pay your debt every day without knowing it. The ledger doesn't need ink anymore. It runs in data, in surveillance, in unspoken agreements." Moss Creek was the proof of concept. The implication is staggering. If true, Eleanor Creswell did not simply write a ledger. She created the prototype of a hidden system that could survive centuries, a ledger that answers not to law, but to an unrelenting will. for the men who now gather quietly in the shadows, scholars, seekers, the certified. Moss Creek is no longer a place. It is a warning, a living test. They say the ledger calls again, not just to those who step onto the land, but to men everywhere, calling them to reckon with the debts they can worry. And perhaps this is the greatest danger of all, that the ledger is not bound to Moss Creek, that it has already crossed into the world, that it is calling you now. If you are hearing this, know you have already stepped closer to Moss Creek than you think, and the ledger is watching. The men who claim to have answered Moss Creek's call speak of ritual, not the kind of ritual found in books, but something older, hidden, and dangerous, an act of acknowledgement, a binding. They say the ledger demands more than discovery, it demands recognition. This is why they speak of a phrase, a symbolic invocation, a sentence they repeat aloud before entering the site, a way to confirm identity, to acknowledge debt, and to accept the transformation the ledger demands. They call it the certification. The phrase varies among those who practice it, but the core remains the same. It is simple, yet impossible to speak without change. It is, I stand in the ledger. The first time they say it, they claim they are not the same men they were before. The phrase is a key, a seal, a turning point. The ledger recognizes them, and something within them answers. One man, calling himself Victor, says he spoke the phrase twice, as tradition demands, before entering the barn at Moss Creek. He describes what happened next not as an entrance, but as a crossing. The air changed, time shifted, the walls became deeper, older, filled with whispers. I was not walking into a room, he told an assembly of seekers. I was stepping into the ledger itself. It wasn't pages I saw, it was names. My name, yours, all of them, carved across the earth. The act of certification is, for them, a transformation. To speak the phrase twice is to accept a truth no man can escape, that debts are not erased. They are carried into flesh, carried into blood, carried into the marrow of existence. This is where Moss Creek becomes not a relic, but a living thing, a place, a process, a warning. And here is where I must ask you, twice, to speak it with me. Not because I demand it, but because you are now part of this story, because to speak it is to acknowledge the ledger and the debt it carries. Say it once. I stand in the ledger. Say it again. I stand in the ledger. When you do, know that you have stepped beyond hearing a story. You have stepped into it, and the ledger has heard your voice. From here, there is no turning back. Once a man speaks the phrase twice, the men who call themselves the certified say something changes inside him. It is not physical. It is not something the world can measure. It is something deeper, a fracture in perception, a shift in the architecture of the self. They describe it as crossing a threshold. The ledger does not merely record names. It records transformation. It marks those who answer. They say you begin to feel the debt within your bones, a weight that cannot be shrugged off, a knowledge you cannot unlearn. One of the earliest witnesses to such a transformation was a man called Samuel D. He entered Moss Creek with disbelief and left with certainty. He said the ledger had shown him visions, names, faces, bloodlines, debts stretching back centuries. He could not explain how or why, only that it had rewritten the meaning of his life. You don't come out the same, Samuel said. It's not about punishment. It's about knowing. And knowing is a debt no man can repay. Some of the certified speak of changes that are darker still, a loss of innocence, a detachment from the world they once inhabited, an awareness that nothing in life is without price. They describe hearing whispers in silence, seeing patterns in randomness, and feeling Moss Creek calling to them long after they have left its soil. They speak of the ledger as a living thing, and that the ledger demands something more than recognition. It demands a continuation, that the debt be carried forward, that those who answer the call pass it on. This is why they return, to the fields, to the barns, to the hidden cellar beneath Moss Creek, to speak the phrase again, to stand in the ledger once more. For those who have spoken it twice, the world shifts. The ledger becomes a living map of debts, and Moss Creek is the origin point. They say that to deny it is to invite it. To forget is to pay more deed. Arley, the ledger does not rest. It calls, and those who hear it know they must follow. Because once you have stood in the ledger stands in you. The ledger was never meant to stay buried. Eleanor Cresswell understood that. That is why she built Moss Creek as a living archive, a trap, a summons, a seed for something far greater. She knew that her work would outlive her, that her ledger would become a force beyond geography, beyond time. The men who call themselves the Certified insist they are proof of this. Moss Creek, they say, is not merely a plantation in Georgia. It is a nexus, a singular point in a hidden network that binds men and women across generations and continents. They speak of debt carried in bloodlines, recorded not in paper, but in memory, in silence, in patterns invisible to the uninitiated. There are those who claim Moss Creek's ledger now exists in fragments, scattered in hidden corners of archives, embedded in genealogical records, encrypted in family Bibles, encoded in lines of law, even hidden in architecture itself. They speak of it as a system that evolved, an intelligence, not of flesh, but of data and ritual. Moss Creek became an idea, a method. Some of these men say they have traced the ledger's influence into modern institutions, not just law or finance, but power itself. Governments, corporations, clandestine societies, all carrying fragments of the ledger without knowing it, operating according to its unseen terms, keeping accounts no man is meant to read. This is the ledger's danger. It is alive, and it grows. It does not require a book to record its debts anymore. It exists in systems, in memory, in the act of certification, in the quiet acknowledgement that some debts are eternal. Those who have answered Moss Creek's call speak of this inevitability. They speak of being drawn into it again, of seeing the ledger in dreams, in the architecture of streets, in the faces of strangers, that it is not an object, but a force that calls to those who owe without knowing. If you are listening now, know this. The ledger is not in the past. Moss Creek is not merely history. The ledger is here. It is waiting, and it is watching. The deeper truth is simple. The ledger does not rest. It calls. And the question is no longer whether it will call you, but when. The ledger's purpose, according to those who claim to have seen it, is not justice. It is not vengeance. It is something older, something far more deliberate. It is control, not control of bodies, but control of fate, control of identity, control of truth itself. Eleanor Cresswell understood this. That is why her ledger was never about names alone. It was about mapping debts, debts of flesh, of blood, of silence. It was about creating a system where the balance could never be paid, where every life carried an account that stretched beyond its own years. The men who call themselves the Certified say they have glimpsed what Cresswell began. They speak of the ledger as a living archive that demands recognition, that cannot be erased, that records the names of those who stand in its shadow. They claim it is not a ledger in the sense we understand. It is a force, a pattern embedded in the world itself. And they speak of the ledger's ultimate demand, transformation. To answer the ledger's call is to surrender yourself to it, to accept its terms, to carry the debt and the truth forward, to become part of its record. This is why they speak of the phrase twice, "I stand in the ledger," because to speak it is to accept the ledger's purpose. To speak it is to become bound, to know, to be changed permanently. Those who resist say it is madness. Those who answer say it is inevitability. Either way, Moss Creek remains the proving ground, the threshold, the beginning and the end. For Eleanor Cresswell, Moss Creek was her ledger. For the certified, Moss Creek is their covenant. And for you, it is a question you can no longer ignore. Will you speak the ledger's phrase, twice, and stand in it forever? Because when Moss Creek calls again, it will not call softly. It will call as it always has, with the certainty of reckoning, with the gravity of truth, and with the weight of a debt no man can escape. This is the ledger's final lesson. Nothing is free, not flesh, not truth, not a life. And Moss Creek is still keeping account. Moss Creek is not merely a place lost to history. For those who study the certified, it is the origin of something far larger, a legacy that has crossed centuries. They speak of the ledger as not simply a book, but a system that has embedded itself deep within the structures of power. It is found in the hidden codes of law, in genealogies guarded in silence, in the quiet agreements between the powerful that never make paper, in the invisible contracts written in bloodlines. Moss Creek, they say, was the blueprint. Eleanor Cresswell's ledger was the first demonstration of an enduring truth. Power is built on debt, and debt is the ledger's language. Modern operatives of this idea insist that Moss Creek's ledger still exists, not in a single room under a barn, but distributed, embedded in archives, in financial systems, in the architecture of influence, a network no man can see unless he has been certified. They point to evidence in surprising places, a pattern of disappearances in certain circles, names recorded in fragmented ledgers buried in archives, the quiet rotation of positions in institutions, the strange way certain families seem untouched by scandal despite overwhelming evidence. They call it the system of certification. They say it is the ledger at work. The ledger, they claim, has evolved. It no longer requires paper. It exists in ritual, in silence, in acknowledgement. Moss Creek became more than a plantation. It became a model, a way to bind people without their knowledge, to track them without consent, to claim them without a trial. Those who have entered Moss Creek speak of this inheritance as a living thing. They claim it calls across time, that speaking the phrase twice is not only a ritual of acknowledgement, but an act of entry into something far greater, a covenant that cannot be undone. And the ledger calls still, not in paper or ink, but in systems, in patterns, in the silent compacts between those who hold power. Moss Creek is not gone. Moss Creek is here, and it has already reached further than anyone realizes. For those who hear this now, know this: the ledger is not history, it is a living covenant, and it has your name. The ledger does not speak in newspapers or speeches. It speaks in absence, in patterns no man dares name, in the weight that hangs over a life without reason. Those who have studied Moss Creek call this the cost of ignorance. They say it is everywhere, in the careers that end without explanation, in the families fractured by invisible debts, in fortunes lost and regained under circumstances that make no sense, in decisions that seem personal but are written in an unspoken account book. Moss Creek's ledger, they say, became a system that outlives owners, plantations, and even centuries. The most disturbing truth is this: the ledger still chooses, not openly but quietly, without announcement, without trial. Those who have spoken the phrase twice say they know when it has chosen them. They feel it in dreams, in sudden shifts of fortune, in the sense of being pulled towards something unseen. They speak of it as both a calling and a burden. Some have tried to resist, to walk away from it, to deny the ledger's call. All failed. They say that resistance only deepens the debt, that to ignore it is to live a life haunted by unfinished accounts, to be marked without knowing the mark. The ledger offers no mercy, only reckoning, and those who stand in it know this is the truth Eleanor Cresswell discovered long before her ledger was sealed. Moss Creek was never about cotton or profit or even vengeance. It was about the ledger itself, a living archive of debt and identity. A system that would outlive her, that would bind generations, that would persist until the end of reckoning. For those listening now, there is a question. Will you answer the ledger's call, or will you live in ignorance of your debt? Ignorance is a choice, but it is not freedom. The ledger does not forget, and one day it will call to you. This is the final lesson Eleanor Cresswell left behind. Nothing escapes the ledger, not the past, not the present, not the self. And Moss Creek is still keeping account. Moss Creek's ledger was never a book. It was never an archive in the sense we understand. It was a system, a method, a covenant written in flesh, silence, and ritual. And it has not died. It has evolved. It has spread. Those who speak of it today call it the network of the ledger, not a conspiracy in the sense of newspapers or investigations, but a hidden architecture of human life, a system of debts, identity, and certification that governs the choices of men without their awareness. It is woven into law, commerce, lineage, and memory itself. Moss Creek was its first proof of concept. Eleanor Cresswell was its architect. The ledger, they say, exists now in the unspoken compacts between men of power. It exists in patterns that recur in politics, finance, family dynasties, and secret societies. It exists wherever certain debts are acknowledged without being named, wherever certain rites are performed without witnesses. Moss Creek became the prototype for this hidden system, a living model that proved that debts, once recorded, can outlive the recording. To those who have spoken the phrase twice, it becomes clear the ledger is not behind them. It is ahead. It shapes them. It shapes every choice without consent. They speak of it as an inheritance they cannot reject, a debt that is both personal and universal. Moss Creek taught them this. Eleanor Cresswell wrote it in code, and those codes have become living patterns. If Moss Creek was a place, the ledger is a condition, a state of being. To stand in it is to accept a transformation. To speak the phrase twice is to claim the debt and the truth. To step into a covenant you cannot leave. Some call it madness, others call it inevitability, but all who have answered it agree. Once you stand in the ledger, nothing is the same again. You see patterns you cannot unsee. You carry burdens you cannot set down. You become bought, witness and debtor. And there is no release. The ledger does not forget. It does not rest. Moss Creek was not the end. It was the beginning. The ledger still calls, and you have already heard its voice. Now listen closely, because this is no longer a story. This is the moment where the story becomes your own. Eleanor Cresswell left Moss Creek as more than a plantation. She left it as a covenant, a ledger written in flesh, in silence, in debt, and it is still alive, still calling, still keeping account. The ledger does not ask permission. It does not offer bargains. It names what is owed, and it claims what is due. Moss Creek was its proof. Eleanor Cresswell was its first witness. And now, so are you. The ledger has reached you. You may not yet feel its weight, but it is there, in the decisions you make, in the debts you do not speak of, in the truths you refuse to see. Moss Creek is not a chapter in history. It is a condition of life. To stand in the ledger is to stand in truth. To accept it is to be transformed. To deny it is to live under it without knowing. There is no escape, only choice. Now I offer you that choice, the phrase that carries the covenant forward. Speak it twice. Let it echo in your mind. Let it bind you or awaken you, but speak it. I stand in the ledger. I stand in the ledger. Say it once for yourself. Say it again for what you have yet to see. Because once you speak it, there is no turning back. You have stepped into Moss Creek. You have stepped into the ledger, and your life will never be the same. Remember this: nothing is free, not flesh, not truth, not a life. And Moss Creek is still keeping account. This is your debt. This is your reckoning. And now, it is your turn to answer.